Nathaniel Blake, a reclusive billionaire with a fortune that can buy anything except the one thing he truly craves: connection. After years of isolating himself in his sterile, towering penthouse, he takes an impulsive leap to fill the void in his life by adopting 9 orphan sisters. For a moment, Nathaniel believes he can provide them the family they desperately need, and in return, they might bring warmth to his empty world. But reality shatters his idealistic vision. The chaos of parenting 9 children overwhelms him, and his fears of inadequacy drive him to a devastating decision. He returns the girls to the foster system. Heartbroken and betrayed, the sisters, especially Charlotte, the eldest, begin to lose faith in promises and second chances. Public outcry and an unexpected act of kindness, however, force Nathaniel to confront his failures. Haunted by guilt, he vows to make things right. But rebuilding trust with the girls, especially the fiercely protective Charlotte, is no small task. Nathaniel must navigate the judgment of a skeptical community, his own insecurities, and the sisters' guarded hearts to prove he's worthy of being called Dad. Nathaniel Blake stood by the window of his lavish penthouse, staring out at the city lights stretching endlessly before him. The apartment was immaculate, each piece of furniture strategically placed, every surface polished to a sheen. But the perfection of his surroundings felt hollow, an unyielding silence that no amount of wealth could fill. His designer suit, tailored to perfection, hung on his lean frame, emphasizing the exhaustion etched into his features. Behind him, faint laughter echoed from the grand living room, where 9 young girls played a clumsy game of tag. They darted between the minimalist sofas and coffee tables, their voices bouncing off the high ceilings. Their joy felt incongruous in this space, like a splash of vibrant paint on a canvas meant to be monochrome. Nathaniel's jaw tightened as he turned to watch them. Charlotte, the eldest at 13, took charge, ensuring the youngest, Hope, who was only 2, stayed out of harm's way. Emily and Grace, 12 and 11 respectively, argued over the rules, while Abigail and Lily, 9 and 8, collapsed into giggles on the floor. Rose, Faith, and Anna added to the chaos, their shrill voices filling every corner of the room. It had been weeks since he brought them here, a decision born of impulsive generosity and a desire to fill the void in his life. He had imagined that adopting these sisters would give him purpose, a reason to rise above his own loneliness. But the reality was far more challenging than he had anticipated. Nathaniel sighed, his head pounding from the noise. He rubbed his temples, wishing he could retreat to his quiet office. But the girls needed supervision, and the staff he had hired for help had quit within days, overwhelmed by the demands of caring for 9 children. "I cannot do this," he muttered under his breath, the words laced with frustration. His eyes lingered on Charlotte, who was now scolding Emily for pushing Abigail. She was a natural leader, but her guarded demeanor reminded him of himself. She glanced his way, her eyes narrowing, as if sensing his hesitation. Later that evening, Nathaniel retreated to his study. His desk, cluttered with contracts and reports, served as a stark contrast to the chaos outside. He poured himself a glass of scotch and stared at his reflection in the darkened window. The man looking back at him seemed a stranger, disheveled, weary, and utterly lost. When he adopted the sisters, he had envisioned himself as a savior, someone who could provide them with a life they deserved. But instead of feeling fulfilled, he felt trapped. His attempts to connect with them were met with skepticism from the older girls and chaotic energy from the younger ones. Nathaniel picked up his phone and dialed Mrs. Jensen, the foster home director. She answered on the second ring, her tone warm and professional. "Mr. Blake, how are the girls adjusting?" Nathaniel hesitated, his chest tightening. "It's not working. I thought I could manage, but I am not equipped for this. I think it's best if they return to the foster system." There was a long pause on the other end, followed by a sigh. "Are you sure? They have been through so much already. Separating them again will only make it harder for them to trust anyone." "I have no choice," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. The next morning, the girls stood in the grand foyer, their suitcases packed. Charlotte held Hope's hand tightly, her face a mask of defiance, while Emily and Grace whispered to each other, casting Nathaniel accusatory glances. Abigail wiped silent tears, and Lily clung to Rose, who tried to comfort her. Faith and Anna stood quietly, their wide eyes filled with confusion. Nathaniel avoided their gazes as the foster home van arrived. He told himself this was the right decision, that they deserved a family better suited to their needs. But as the girls filed out, he caught Charlotte's parting words. "We trusted you," she said, her voice steady but laced with anger. "You promised." Her words pierced him, but he stood frozen, unable to respond. Days turned into weeks, and life returned to its sterile monotony. Nathaniel immersed himself in work, hoping to silence the gnawing guilt that lingered in the back of his mind. But the media was relentless. Headlines like "Billionaire Abandons Adopted Sisters" and "Promises Broken." The Blake ordeal splashed across tabloids and news websites. Social media was even harsher, painting him as a callous opportunist who used the girls for publicity. His reputation, carefully built over decades, began to crumble. At first, Nathaniel dismissed the backlash as irrelevant. But then a letter arrived. The envelope was plain, the handwriting neat and deliberate. Inside was a handwritten note from a school counselor named Mrs. Williams. "Dear Mr. Blake, I have worked with children like Charlotte and her sisters for years. They are resilient, but their resilience comes at a cost. Each disappointment chips away at their hope. Your actions have hurt them deeply, but it is not too late to make amends. These girls do not need perfection. They need someone willing to try. Please reconsider. Sincerely, Evelyn Williams." Nathaniel stared at the letter for a long time, his chest tight. It was the first time anyone had addressed him with such honesty and compassion. The guilt he had suppressed began to surface, forcing him to confront the weight of his choices. But he still felt paralyzed. He had already failed once. How could he risk failing again? One evening, as he walked through a quiet park near his penthouse, he noticed a man helping a young boy fix a bike. The boy looked up at the man with admiration, his face beaming when the chain was set back in place. "That should do it," the man said with a smile, patting the boy's shoulder. Nathaniel felt an ache in his chest. The interaction was so simple, so unremarkable, yet it carried a warmth that had eluded him. For the first time, he wondered if he had underestimated his ability to provide that kind of care. As he returned home, he found himself replaying Charlotte's words. "You promised." Nathaniel poured himself another glass of scotch, but the warmth of the drink offered no comfort. He looked out at the city again, the lights blurred by unshed tears. "I have to try," he whispered to himself. The next morning, he called Mrs. Jensen. "I want to visit the girls," he said, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. "They will need to see more than just words this time, Mr. Blake," Mrs. Jensen replied. Nathaniel knew she was right. This time, he would have to prove himself worthy of their trust. Nathaniel Blake sat stiffly in the back of his town car, the steady hum of the engine doing little to calm his nerves. The letter from Mrs. Williams weighed heavily in his coat pocket, its quiet truths still echoing in his mind. He was on his way to the Starlight Haven foster home, a place he had vowed not to return to after abandoning the sisters weeks ago. As the car pulled into the gravel driveway, Nathaniel's stomach churned. The modest building stood as a stark reminder of the day he had walked away from 9 hopeful faces. A pang of guilt struck him as he stepped out, his polished shoes crunching on the gravel. Mrs. Jensen greeted him at the door, her expression neutral, but her eyes sharp. "Mr. Blake," she said, her tone clipped. "Thank you for coming. The girls are in the playroom." Nathaniel nodded, unable to find his voice. The sound of laughter and chatter drifted down the hallway as Mrs. Jensen led him through the building. When they reached the door, she paused and turned to him. "They've been adjusting," she said carefully, "but their trust is fragile. Do not make promises you cannot keep." He swallowed hard and nodded. Inside, the room was a kaleidoscope of activity. Charlotte sat at a small table, helping Hope color inside the lines of a cartoon book. Emily and Grace were building a lopsided tower with wooden blocks, while Abigail and Lily argued over the rules of a card game. Rose, Faith, and Anna sat together on a beanbag, giggling over something on a tablet. The moment he stepped inside, the laughter stopped. Charlotte's gaze snapped to him, her expression hardening. Emily and Grace exchanged glances, their smiles fading. The younger girls looked confused, their wide eyes flickering between Nathaniel and their older sisters. "Why are you here?" Charlotte asked coldly, standing protectively in front of Hope. Nathaniel cleared his throat, feeling the weight of every pair of eyes in the room. I came to see how you're doing." "We're fine," Charlotte said, her voice clipped. Nathaniel took a hesitant step closer. "I know I hurt you. I made a mistake, and A mistake." Charlotte interrupted, her tone sharp. "You brought us to your house, told us we were a family, and then threw us away. That's not a mistake. That's a choice." The words hit Nathaniel like a punch to the gut. He glanced at Mrs. Jensen, who stood silently near the door, her arms crossed. "You're right," he said finally, his voice low. "I failed you, and I know I cannot undo that, but I want to make it right." Charlotte's eyes narrowed. "Why should we believe you? You only came because people are angry at you. You're just trying to fix your reputation." Nathaniel flinched at the accusation, knowing there was some truth in it. But beneath the public outcry, his guilt had grown into something deeper, something he could no longer ignore. Before he could respond, a voice interrupted. "Who's that?" Nathaniel turned to see a man standing in the doorway. He was in his 30s, with a warm smile and a casual demeanor. "This is Mark," Mrs. Jensen said, her tone softening. "He's one of our volunteers." Mark stepped into the room, holding a stack of books. "Sorry to interrupt," he said, setting the books on a table. "I just want to drop these off for story time." Nathaniel watched as Mark knelt beside Rose, showing her one of the books. She smiled shyly, her earlier tension melting away. "You're good with them," Nathaniel said quietly. Mark glanced at him and smiled. "I was one of them once. Growing up in the system is tough. Sometimes, all it takes is one person who believes in you to make a difference." Nathaniel felt the weight of those words settle over him. The thought lingered as he watched Mark interact with the girls, his kindness so natural and unforced. The car ride back to Nathaniel's penthouse was silent. His mind churned with doubt and regret, replaying Charlotte's words and Mark's quiet wisdom. When he stepped into his apartment, the stillness was deafening. The dining table, once chaotic with spilled cereal and crayon marks, was spotless again. The air carried none of the laughter or bickering that had once filled the space. He walked to the window and stared out at the city, his reflection superimposed over the skyline. For the first time, he admitted to himself what he had tried to bury. He missed them. The house, with all its opulence, felt empty without the girl's presence. Nathaniel sat down at his desk and pulled out the letter from Mrs. Williams. Her words about resilience and the need for someone to try echoed in his mind. He picked up his phone and dialed Mrs. Jensen. "I want to help," he said when she answered. "Even if they never trust me again, I want to help them have a better life." Mrs. Jensen was quiet for a moment before responding. "Actions speak louder than words, Mr. Blake. If you mean it, show them." Over the next few weeks, Nathaniel began making quiet contributions to the foster system. He funded after-school programs, scholarships, and recreational activities for the children at Starlight Haven. He avoided publicity, wanting the focus to remain on the kids rather than himself. But no matter how much he gave, he couldn't shake the emptiness that lingered in his heart. He realized he wasn't just trying to make amends for the girls, he was trying to fill the void they had left behind. One day, a small package arrived at his office. Inside was a crayon drawing of a house, surrounded by 9 stick figures. In the corner, a note written in Rose's uneven handwriting read, "We miss you. Love, Rose." Nathaniel stared at the drawing, his throat tightening. For the first time in weeks, he allowed himself to hope. He picked up his phone and called Mrs. Jensen again. "Can I visit them?" he asked, his voice steady but hopeful. There was a pause before she replied. "If you're ready to prove you're here for the right reasons, Mr. Blake, I'll arrange it." The soft hum of the engine felt louder in Nathaniel Blake's ears as the car made its way back to Starlight Haven Foster Home. This time, the nervous anticipation was almost unbearable. In the weeks since receiving Rose's drawing, the simple crayon lines had haunted him. A house, a family, 9 little figures, she had drawn them all smiling, including him. He folded and unfolded his hands in his lap, unsure what to expect when he saw the girls again. Would they still be angry? Would they even want to see him? When the car stopped, Nathaniel hesitated before stepping out, his polished shoes crunching on the gravel as he approached the entrance. Mrs. Jensen stood waiting, her arms crossed and her expression guarded. "They're in the playroom," she said without preamble. "Thank you," Nathaniel replied, his voice steady despite the tightness in his chest. Mrs. Jensen led him down the hallway, the now familiar sound of children's laughter and chatter filtering through the building. The door to the playroom was slightly ajar, and Nathaniel peeked in. The scene was almost identical to his last visit. Charlotte sat with Hope in her lap, guiding the toddler's tiny hands as she stacked blocks. Emily and Grace were sorting through a pile of brightly colored craft supplies, while Abigail and Lily played a card game. Rose, Faith, and Anna were clustered around a small bookshelf, flipping through storybooks. Nathaniel took a deep breath and stepped inside. The moment he entered, the room stilled. 9 pairs of eyes turned to him, a mix of surprise, suspicion, and curiosity flickering across their faces. "Mr. Blake," Charlotte said, her tone formal and cold. "What are you doing here?" Nathaniel hesitated, meeting her piercing gaze. "I came to see you," he said finally, "and to apologize." Again, the tension in the room was palpable. Charlotte's shoulders stiffened, and she pulled Hope closer. Emily crossed her arms, her expression skeptical. Grace looked between her older sisters and Nathaniel, as if unsure which side to take. Rose was the first to break the silence. She stood up and walked over to Nathaniel, clutching a piece of paper in her small hands. "Did you like my picture?" she asked, her voice soft but curious. Nathaniel knelt to her level, his gaze softening. "I loved it," he said. "It's what made me realize how much I missed all of you." Rose's face lit up, and she glanced back at her sisters as if seeking their approval. Charlotte frowned, but didn't say anything. "I don't trust you," Emily said bluntly, breaking the moment. "You said we were family, and then you left." "I know," Nathaniel replied, standing. "And you have every right to feel that way. I let you down." He paused, searching for the right words. "But I want to earn your trust back. I don't expect it to happen overnight, but I'm here to try." Charlotte narrowed her eyes, her arms tightening around Hope. "Why now?" "Because I made a mistake," Nathaniel said simply. "And I want to fix it, if you'll let me." There was a long silence. Then, to Nathaniel's surprise, Mark, the shelter volunteer, entered the room carrying a tray of snacks. He glanced between Nathaniel and the girls, immediately sensing the tension. "Hey, Mr. Blake," Mark said casually, setting the tray on a table. "Good to see you back." Nathaniel nodded, grateful for the distraction. Mark turned to the girls with an easy smile. "Did I ever tell you guys about the time I met my foster dad? I hated him at first." The younger girls giggled, intrigued, while the older ones remained cautious. "Why?" Abigail asked. Mark pulled up a chair and sat down, gesturing for them to gather around. "Because I thought he was just another adult who wouldn't stick around. But you know what he did? He kept showing up every week, even when I ignored him, even when I told him to leave me alone." The room was silent, all eyes on Mark. "One day," Mark continued, "I realized he wasn't going anywhere. He wasn't perfect, but he cared, and that was enough for me to start trusting him." Nathaniel listened intently, his heart heavy with a mix of guilt and hope. Mark glanced at him, then back at the girls. "Sometimes people mess up, but if they're willing to put in the effort, it's worth giving them another chance. You never know what kind of family you might end up with." Charlotte's expression softened, but she remained quiet. Emily looked at Nathaniel, her skepticism slightly tempered. Rose tugged on Nathaniel's sleeve. "Are you going to keep coming back?" she asked. Nathaniel knelt again, looking her in the eye. "Yes," he said firmly. "I'll keep coming back as long as it takes." Over the next hour, Nathaniel stayed in the playroom, observing more than participating. He didn't want to push too hard, knowing the older girls needed time. But when Hope toddled over to him and offered him a crayon, he accepted it with a smile. By the end of the visit, even Emily seemed less hostile, though she maintained her distance. Charlotte, however, remained a wall of quiet defiance, her trust far from restored. When it was time for him to leave, Nathaniel hesitated at the door. "Thank you for letting me visit," he said, addressing all of them but looking at Charlotte. She didn't respond, but Rose waved enthusiastically, and Hope blew him a kiss. It wasn't much, but it was a start. As Nathaniel walked back to his car, Mark caught up with him. "You did good in there," Mark said. "They're tough, but they're worth it." Nathaniel nodded, his throat tight. "I hope I'm not too late." "You're not," Mark said firmly. "You just need to keep showing up." That night, Nathaniel sat in his quiet penthouse, the emptiness less suffocating than before. He opened Rose's drawing again, running his fingers over the crayon lines. For the first time in months, he felt a flicker of hope. Nathaniel Blake sat at his desk in the study of his penthouse, the city skyline sprawling beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows. The drawing Rose had made a house surrounded by smiling stick figures was propped against a silver desk lamp. It had become his constant companion, a reminder of what he was fighting for. His laptop screen displayed a list of potential donations and programs he could fund for Starlight Haven. A proposal from Mrs. Jensen detailed scholarships, extracurricular activities, and therapeutic resources for the children. Nathaniel had already approved most of the requests, but something about writing checks felt inadequate. As he stared at the screen, his phone buzzed with an incoming call from Mrs. Jensen. He picked up, leaning back in his chair. "Mr. Blake, I just wanted to thank you," she began. "The funding you've provided has already made a huge difference for the kids. They're thrilled about the new art supplies and soccer equipment." "That's good to hear," Nathaniel said, though the warmth in her words didn't fully reach him. "Some of the girls have been asking about you," Mrs. Jensen added cautiously. Nathaniel froze. "What did they say?" "They're curious. Rose especially. She keeps telling the others you'll come back, that you're different this time." Nathaniel's throat tightened. "I will come back, but I need to do more first. I want them to see that I mean it." Mrs. Jensen was quiet for a moment before saying, "Actions speak louder than words, Mr. Blake. Sometimes the small things matter more than the grand gestures." Over the next few weeks, Nathaniel committed himself to finding ways to make a tangible difference. He sponsored field trips for the foster children, hired additional staff for the shelter, and even funded a mentorship program. But despite the progress, he couldn't shake the nagging sense that something was missing. The grand gestures were meaningful, but they lacked the personal connection he craved. One evening, as he reviewed plans for a new playground at the foster home, his phone chimed with a notification. It was an email from Rose, sent through Mrs. Jensen's account. "Dear Mr. Blake, thank you for the new books and toys. Faith and Anna love the puzzles, and Hope likes the big teddy bear. We all miss you. Are you coming back soon? Love, Rose." Nathaniel stared at the screen, the simple words striking a chord deep within him. They missed him. Despite everything, they still wanted him in their lives. He replied quickly, promising another visit and asking what they wanted to do next time he came. When the response came a day later, it included a list written in colorful, uneven handwriting: baking cookies, playing hide-and-seek, and reading stories. The simplicity of their requests humbled him. He had been so focused on grand gestures that he'd forgotten what truly mattered. When Nathaniel arrived at Starlight Haven the following weekend, he carried a large tote bag filled with cookie cutters, sprinkles, and ingredients for baking. Mrs. Jensen raised an eyebrow, but said nothing as she led him to the kitchen. The girls were already waiting, their faces lighting up when they saw him. Rose ran to greet him, tugging at his sleeve. "You really came," she said, her excitement contagious. "I said I would," Nathaniel replied, his smile genuine. The kitchen quickly became a whirlwind of activity. Abigail and Lily argued over how much sugar to use, while Emily and Grace carefully measured flour and cracked eggs. Charlotte stood back, her arms crossed, watching skeptically. "Charlotte, want to help?" Nathaniel asked, holding up a rolling pin. She hesitated, then shook her head. "I'm fine." Nathaniel didn't push. Instead, he focused on the younger girls, who were eagerly shaping cookies into stars, hearts, and animals. Hope clapped her hands as Nathaniel placed a tray in the oven. As the cookies baked, the tension in the room softened. Rose and Faith decorated with colorful frosting, while Anna snuck sprinkles in her mouth when she thought no one was looking. Even Charlotte eventually took a seat at the table, though she remained quiet. "Not bad for your first time baking," Emily said, surprising him with a rare smile. Nathaniel chuckled. "I had good teachers." Later, as the girls devoured their creations, Mrs. Jensen pulled Nathaniel aside. "They're happier when you're here," she said, her tone measured. "But you should know, Charlotte is still struggling. She feels responsible for her sisters, and she's afraid to trust you again." Nathaniel nodded, the weight of her words settling over him. "I'll keep trying." Mrs. Jensen gave him a rare smile. "That's all they need." That night, back in his penthouse, Nathaniel sat at his desk, replaying the day in his mind. It had been chaotic and messy, but it had also been the first time he'd felt a genuine connection with the girls since their arrival. The crayon drawing on his desk seemed brighter somehow, a beacon of hope guiding him forward. He picked up his phone and sent a text to Mrs. Jensen. "Can I visit again next weekend?" The reply came almost instantly. "Of course." Nathaniel leaned back in his chair, a small smile tugging at his lips. For the first time in a long while, he felt like he was on the right path. Nathaniel Blake approached Starlight Haven for the third time in as many weeks, feeling a mix of anticipation and trepidation. His previous visits had gone better than he'd dared to hope, yet Charlotte's guarded demeanor lingered at the edges of his thoughts. She was the key, he realized. If he could earn her trust, the rest of the sisters might follow. This time, he arrived without fanfare, carrying a small duffel bag instead of grand gestures. Inside were simple items: a deck of cards, a puzzle set, and a well-worn copy of The Secret Garden. Mrs. Jensen greeted him with a nod as he entered. "They're in the rec room," she said. "They've been asking about you since yesterday." Nathaniel smiled faintly. "How's Charlotte?" Mrs. Jensen hesitated. "She's the hardest to reach, but she's watching you. Every little thing you do matters to her, even if she doesn't show it." The rec room was alive with activity. Rose and Faith were sprawled on the floor, playing with dolls. Grace and Abigail were painting at an easel, their sleeves rolled up to their elbows. Emily sat on the couch with Hope, pointing at pictures in a brightly colored book. Charlotte stood near the window, her arms crossed, gazing outside. She turned slightly when Nathaniel entered but said nothing. "Good afternoon," Nathaniel said, his voice light but warm. "Mr. Blake," Rose exclaimed, running to him. She tugged at his sleeve. "Did you bring anything fun?" Nathaniel crouched down and opened the duffel bag, pulling out the deck of cards. "How about a game of Go Fish?" The younger girls swarmed him, giggling as he began shuffling the cards. Abigail and Lily joined the game enthusiastically, while Grace sat nearby, watching with a smile. Even Emily leaned in, her curiosity piqued. Charlotte remained at the window. Nathaniel glanced at her occasionally, hoping she might join, but she stayed rooted to her spot. After a few rounds of Go Fish, Nathaniel reached into the bag again and pulled out The Secret Garden. "I used to read this when I was a kid," he said, holding up the book. "Would you like me to read it aloud?" The younger girls nodded eagerly, settling onto the floor in a makeshift circle. Nathaniel took a seat on the couch and opened the book, his deep voice filling the room as he began to read. As he read, Nathaniel noticed Charlotte glance over her shoulder. She lingered near the window for a few more moments before finally crossing the room and sitting at the edge of the circle. She didn't say a word, but her presence felt like a small victory. By the time he finished the first chapter, the younger girls were fully engrossed. Hope had fallen asleep in Emily's lap, and Rose was leaning against Nathaniel's leg, her eyes wide with fascination. "That was nice," Grace said softly when he closed the book. Nathaniel smiled. "We can read more next time." After the story, the girls dispersed to their various activities. Nathaniel moved to the corner where Charlotte had retreated, fiddling with an old chess set. "Do you play?" he asked, gesturing to the board. Charlotte looked up, her expression wary. "A little. My mom taught me before everything." Nathaniel nodded, sensing the weight of her words. "Would you teach me? I'm terrible at chess." She hesitated, then shrugged. "Sure." They began setting up the board in silence. Charlotte's movements were precise, her focus intense. Nathaniel watched her, marveling at her resilience and poise despite everything she'd endured. "Why do you keep coming back?" she asked suddenly, her tone cautious but curious. Nathaniel paused, considering his answer carefully. "Because I want to do better. I made a mistake when I let you go. I thought I wasn't good enough to be what you needed. But I realized that trying and failing is better than not trying at all." Charlotte's hands hovered over the pieces, her eyes narrowing. "What if you fail again?" "I might," Nathaniel admitted. "But I won't stop trying. Not this time." Her gaze softened slightly, though her expression remained guarded. "Your move," she said, gesturing to the board. By the time the game ended, the other girls were starting to gather around again, curious about the match. "Who won?" Emily asked, peering over Nathaniel's shoulder. Charlotte smirked faintly. "Me, of course." Nathaniel chuckled. "She's a tough opponent." For the first time, Charlotte smiled, just a small, fleeting smile, but it was enough to light a spark of hope in Nathaniel's chest. As Nathaniel prepared to leave, the girls crowded around him, asking when he would visit again. "Soon," he promised. "Maybe next weekend." Rose hugged him tightly, her small arms barely reaching around his waist. "Bye, Mr. Blake." Charlotte hung back, watching silently. But as Nathaniel turned to leave, she spoke up. "Good game," she said quietly. Nathaniel turned, meeting her gaze. "Thanks, Charlotte. See you next time." That night, back in his penthouse, Nathaniel sat at his desk, the chessboard still fresh in his mind. Charlotte's guarded smile lingered with him, a symbol of the fragile trust he was beginning to build. He reached for his phone and sent Mrs. Jensen a text. "Today was a good day." The reply came quickly. "Keep going." Nathaniel smiled to himself, determination settling into his bones. He would keep going, no matter how long it took. Nathaniel arrived at Starlight Haven the following weekend with a newfound sense of purpose. For the first time since his journey to reconnect with the sisters began, he felt a fragile but genuine connection forming. Charlotte's tentative smile, after their chess game, had lingered in his thoughts all week. It wasn't much, but it was a crack in the wall she had built around herself, a small but significant step toward trust. As he stepped into the foster home's warm, bustling entryway, Mrs. Jensen greeted him with her usual calm efficiency. "The girls have been asking when you'd get here," she said, handing him a visitor badge. Charlotte especially, though of course she'd never admit it. Nathaniel smiled, adjusting the strap of the bag, slung over his shoulder. Inside were supplies for a project he'd been planning all week, of family tree activity he hoped would encourage the girls to share their stories and, perhaps, begin to see themselves as part of a new kind of family. "They're in the rec room," Mrs. Jensen added, her tone softening. "Good luck today." The room burst into excitement as Nathaniel entered. Rose and Faith immediately ran to him, chattering about their morning, while Hope toddled over, arms outstretched for a hug. The older girls greeted him more reservedly, though even Emily offered a small smile. Nathaniel glanced at Charlotte, who was perched on the arm of a couch with a book in hand. She met his gaze briefly, then looked away, her expression unreadable. "I brought something special today," Nathaniel announced, setting his bag on a table. The girls crowded around, curiosity lighting their faces. He pulled out sheets of sturdy paper, markers, and a stack of pre-cut leaves in various shades of green. "We're going to make a family tree," he explained. "Each leaf will have something about you, your name, favorite color, something you like to do. Together, we'll build a tree that shows how we're all connected." The younger girls immediately lit up with excitement, diving into the supplies. Rose picked a bright pink marker and began writing her name, while Lily helped Faith think of her favorite activity. Abigail focused intently on her leaf, carefully spelling out drawing in bold letters. Nathaniel glanced at Charlotte, who remained on the couch, watching but not participating. He walked over and crouched beside her. "You don't have to join if you're not ready," he said gently. "But I'd love to hear what you'd write if you did." Charlotte hesitated, her fingers tightening around the edge of her book. "I don't know," she said finally. "We've never had a real family tree before." Nathaniel nodded, his tone calm and steady. "I understand, but this tree doesn't have to be perfect. It's just a way for us to get to know each other better." She looked at him, her expression softening slightly, then closed her book and stood. Phoenix, but only because Rose is going to make it all pink if someone doesn't stop her. Nathaniel chuckled. Fair point. As the project unfolded, the girls grew more animated, sharing snippets of their personalities and interests. Grace wrote about her love of science experiments, while Emily proudly added her favorite hobby, solving riddles. When Charlotte finally sat down at the table, she chose a leaf and picked up a marker. After a few moments of thought, she wrote in neat letters, "Charlotte protecting my sisters." Nathaniel's chest tightened as he read the words. It was a reminder of how much responsibility she carried for someone so young. He reached for another leaf and wrote his own entry. Nathaniel learning to be a good dad. He pinned his leaf next to Charlotte's on the tree. She noticed and raised an eyebrow. Ambitious, she said, though her tone wasn't as sharp as he expected. I'll take it one day at a time, he replied, meeting her gaze. As the tree grew, it became a colorful, chaotic masterpiece, each leaf telling a small but significant story. When it was finished, Nathaniel stepped back with the girls to admire their work. This looks amazing, he said, genuinely impressed. Best tree ever, Rose declared, throwing her arms in the air. Even Charlotte smiled faintly, her arms crossed as she regarded the creation. Later, while the younger girls played outside, Nathaniel found Charlotte alone in the kitchen, rinsing paintbrushes. He leaned against the counter, his voice casual. You did great today, he said. Thank you for helping with the tree. Charlotte shrugged, focusing on the brush in her hand. It wasn't bad. Nathaniel hesitated, then decided to take a risk. I know you've been looking out for your sisters for a long time, he said carefully. I can't imagine how hard that must have been. Charlotte stilled, the water running over the brush in her hand. It's not hard, she said after a long pause. It's just what I have to do. But you shouldn't have to do it alone, Nathaniel said gently. She looked at him, her eyes sharp but not unkind. You're trying, she said finally. That's more than I expected. I'll keep trying, Nathaniel promised. For all of you. Charlotte nodded, a flicker of trust passing across her face. As Nathaniel left that evening, the family tree packed carefully in the back of his car, he felt a quiet sense of accomplishment. It wasn't a perfect day, but it was progress. Charlotte's words echoed in his mind as he drove back to the city. You're trying. That's more than I expected. For the first time, he felt like he might actually be earning the trust he so desperately sought. The framed family tree sat proudly on Nathaniel Blake's desk, a colorful reminder of the progress he had made with the girls. Each leaf told a story of favorite hobby, a cherished memory, or a glimpse of their unique personalities. Every time he looked at it, he felt the faint but growing belief that he might be able to give them the family they deserved. But as he prepared for his next visit to Starlight Haven, Nathaniel couldn't ignore the lingering unease he felt about Charlotte. While the other girls had started to warm up to him, she remained cautious, her trust still fragile. He packed his bag with a new idea in mind, a dinner where everyone could share stories about their pasts. It would be a chance to bond further and, he hoped, encourage Charlotte to open up. The girls greeted him with their usual excitement, Rose and Hope running to him first, followed by Faith and Anna, their chatter blending into a cheerful symphony. Charlotte hung back, her expression neutral, but Nathaniel caught the briefest flicker of a smile before she looked away. After some time, playing outside with the younger girls and reading another chapter of The Secret Garden, Nathaniel gathered everyone in the dining area. Tonight, I thought we could try something different, he said as the girls settled around the table. I want us to share stories about ourselves, something important or meaningful that you want the rest of us to know. Grace tilted her head, intrigued. Like a game? Sort of, Nathaniel said, smiling. I'll go first to make it easier. The girls exchanged glances, and even Charlotte leaned in slightly, her curiosity evident despite her guarded demeanor. Nathaniel began hesitantly, the vulnerability of sharing his story a new and daunting experience. When I was a kid, he said, his voice steady but soft, I didn't have much of a family. My parents were always busy, and they weren't exactly warm or encouraging. I grew up thinking that if I worked hard enough and made enough money, I could fix everything. The girls listened intently, even the younger ones, who usually had shorter attention spans. But when I finally had everything I thought I wanted, he continued, I realized I was still lonely. That's why I brought you here. I thought I could give you what I never had, but I didn't know how to be a family, and I let you down. Charlotte's gaze was sharp, but it lacked the anger that had been there before. I'm still learning, Nathaniel said, but I promise I'm not giving up this time. The table was quiet for a moment before Rose spoke up. I liked your story, she said, her voice bright. Faith nodded. Me too. Who's next? Nathaniel asked, looking around the table. The girls began to share their stories one by one. Rose talked about her favorite teacher at her old school, and Grace shared a funny memory about the time she tried to make slime but ended up with a sticky mess. Abigail talked about her love for drawing, and Lily described a family of squirrels she used to watch from her bedroom window. When it was Emily's turn, she hesitated, then said, I remember when we all got to stay up late one night to watch a meteor shower. It was before things got hard. Mom made hot chocolate, and we all sat on a blanket in the yard. It was really nice. The room grew quiet, the weight of her words settling over the table. Nathaniel saw Charlotte's jaw tighten, her hands clasping the edge of her chair. Finally, Charlotte spoke, her voice calm but edged with tension. I remember that too. I also remember what it was like to lose everything. She glanced at Nathaniel, her gaze steady. It's hard to trust people when they leave, even when they say they won't. The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken emotion. I understand, Nathaniel said quietly, and I don't expect you to trust me right away, but I'll keep showing up, no matter how long it takes. Charlotte looked at him for a long moment before nodding slightly. It wasn't an apology or forgiveness, but it was something. After dinner, as the younger girls played in the living room, Nathaniel found Charlotte sitting on the back steps, gazing at the stars. He sat down beside her, leaving enough space to respect her boundaries. I'm sorry if my story brought up bad memories, he said gently. Charlotte shook her head. It's not that. I've had to take care of everyone for so long. It's hard to let someone else try. Nathaniel's chest tightened at her words. You've done an incredible job taking care of them, he said. But you don't have to do it alone anymore. That's what family is for. Charlotte was silent for a while, her gaze fixed on the sky. Finally, she said, I guess we'll see. As Nathaniel drove home that night, he felt a mixture of hope and uncertainty. Sharing his story had been a step forward, but he knew there was still a long road ahead. The framed family tree sat on the seat beside him, a colorful symbol of their progress. Each story shared tonight added another layer to their fragile bond, and Nathaniel was determined to keep building on it, no matter how many challenges lay ahead. Nathaniel returned to Starlight Haven the following weekend, carrying a tray of supplies for a new project. The previous dinner and storytelling session had left him hopeful, but also keenly aware of how much work lay ahead. Charlotte's quiet acknowledgement on the back steps had stayed with him, a reminder that trust wasn't given lightly, it had to be earned. When he stepped into the rec room, the girls greeted him with their usual enthusiasm. Rose ran to him, nearly toppling the tray from his hands, while Faith and Anna peered curiously at what he had brought. Abigail and Grace joined quickly, their interest piqued by the promise of another activity. Charlotte and Emily hung back, though both were watching closely. Charlotte, as usual, kept her distance, her expression skeptical but not unfriendly. What are we doing today? Abigail asked, tugging at Nathaniel's sleeve. I thought we could make something for the whole community, Nathaniel said, setting the tray down on the table. We're going to decorate flower pots and plant some seeds. Once they grow, we'll give the flowers to people in the neighborhood. The younger girls lit up at the idea, immediately diving into the colorful paints and brushes Nathaniel had brought. It's like giving presents, Rose said as she began painting a bright pink butterfly on her pot. Exactly, Nathaniel said with a smile. It's a way to spread a little kindness. The project quickly turned into a lively, creative session. Abigail and Grace worked with precision, their designs intricate and detailed. Lily and Rose splattered paint with wild enthusiasm, laughing as they accidentally smeared it on their hands and arms. Charlotte sat at the edge of the table, her pot untouched. Nathaniel noticed, but didn't push. Instead, he focused on the younger girls, helping Hope dip her tiny hands in paint to make colorful prints on her pot. Eventually, Charlotte picked up a brush and began painting quietly. Nathaniel watched out of the corner of his eye, noting the careful strokes she used to create a small, delicate tree on her pot. "That's beautiful," he said softly, careful not to break her focus. Charlotte didn't respond, but her brush continued moving steadily. As the girls finished their pots and set them aside to dry, Mrs. Jensen entered the room, a clipboard in hand. "Mr. Blake," she said, her tone polite but firm, "can I speak with you for a moment?" Nathaniel followed her into the hallway, his brow furrowing. "Is something wrong?" Mrs. Jensen sighed, her expression a mix of weariness and concern. "Not wrong, exactly. But some of the families in the neighborhood have expressed doubts about your involvement here. They're not convinced your intentions are genuine." Nathaniel's stomach sank. "What kind of doubts?" "They think you're doing this for attention, or to repair your reputation after what happened with the girls," Mrs. Jensen said bluntly. "Some have even suggested that your donations come with strings attached." Nathaniel's jaw tightened. "That's not true. Everything I've done has been for the girls." "I know that," Mrs. Jensen said. "But the community doesn't know you like I do. They see a billionaire trying to play the hero, and they don't trust it." Nathaniel nodded slowly, her words cutting deep. "What can I do to change their minds?" Mrs. Jensen gave him a pointed look. "Keep showing up. Keep doing the work. Actions speak louder than words." Back in the rec room, Nathaniel tried to push aside his frustration. The girls were filling their painted pots with soil, their hands dirty but their spirits high. Watching them, he felt a renewed determination. Later that afternoon, as they began cleaning up, a neighbor, Mr. Hayes, arrived to drop off supplies for the foster home. The retired teacher was a kind, soft-spoken man who often volunteered his time. "What's all this?" Mr. Hayes asked, gesturing to the colorful pots lined up on the windowsill. "The girls made flower pots to give to the community," Nathaniel explained. "It was their idea to spread kindness." Mr. Hayes smiled, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "A fine idea," he said, his voice warm. "I'll make sure to tell people about it. Good news deserves to be shared." Charlotte, standing nearby, glanced at Mr. Hayes, then at Nathaniel. "Do you think they'll even want them?" she asked, her tone tinged with doubt. Nathaniel crouched to her level, his voice steady. "Not everyone will, but that doesn't mean it isn't worth trying. Sometimes, even small gestures can make a big difference." Charlotte studied him for a moment before nodding. Over the next week, Nathaniel worked with the girls to deliver the flower pots to nearby families and businesses. For every polite but indifferent recipient, there was someone like Mr. Hayes genuinely touched by the gesture. Slowly, word began to spread about the project. A local cafe displayed one of the pots in its window, and a florist offered to donate seeds for the next round of planting. Nathaniel's quiet determination didn't go unnoticed. Mrs. Jensen informed him that several skeptical neighbors had softened their stance, impressed by his persistence and the joy the girls were bringing to the community. One evening, as Nathaniel prepared to leave Starlight Haven, Charlotte approached him in the hallway. "I guess the flowers weren't a bad idea," she said, her tone neutral but lacking its usual sharpness. Nathaniel smiled. "I'm glad you think so." Charlotte hesitated, then added, "Maybe you're not just doing this for attention. Maybe you actually care." "I do care," Nathaniel said firmly. "About all of you." Charlotte met his gaze, her expression unreadable. Then she nodded once, a small but significant gesture. As Nathaniel drove home that night, he felt a cautious sense of accomplishment. The skepticism of the community and of Charlotte wasn't entirely gone, but it was starting to fade. For the first time, he felt like he was truly becoming part of something bigger than himself. It started with heavy rain, the kind that drummed on windows and turned roads into shallow rivers. Nathaniel Blake was at home, preparing for his next visit to Starlight Haven, when Mrs. Jensen's call came through. "We need help," she said, her voice steady but urgent. "The storm has caused severe flooding. The lower level of the foster home is already underwater, and we've had to move the children upstairs. The roads are blocked, and we don't have enough supplies for everyone." "I'll be there as soon as I can," Nathaniel replied without hesitation. "Be careful," Mrs. Jensen warned. It's dangerous out there. Nathaniel hung up and immediately set to work. He called his driver, who refused to risk the flooded roads, so Nathaniel grabbed his keys and headed out himself. His SUV was sturdy, and he trusted his ability to navigate the treacherous streets. When Nathaniel arrived at the foster home, the scene was chaotic. The front yard was submerged, and volunteers were working to carry children and supplies to higher ground. Nathaniel waded through the ankle-deep water, clutching a box of food and blankets he'd picked up on the way. Inside, the atmosphere was tense but orderly. The girls were huddled together in a corner of the rec room, which had been converted into a makeshift shelter. Charlotte spotted Nathaniel first, her eyes widening. "You came," she said, her tone a mix of relief and surprise. "Of course," Nathaniel said, setting the box down. "Are you all okay?" Charlotte nodded, glancing at her sisters. "We're fine. Just scared." Nathaniel placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "We'll get through this." Over the next few hours, Nathaniel threw himself into helping wherever he could. He carried supplies, comforted frightened children, and worked alongside the staff to organize sleeping arrangements. At one point, he found himself next to Mark, the ever-dependable volunteer. "You didn't have to come out here in this storm," Mark said, handing him a towel. Nathaniel shrugged. "They needed help. That's all there is to it." Mark nodded approvingly. "You're starting to get it." As the night wore on, the storm intensified. Water seeped under doors despite their best efforts to barricade the entrances, and the power flickered intermittently. Nathaniel noticed Charlotte pacing near the windows, her arms crossed tightly. "Hey," he said, approaching her. "What's on your mind?" Charlotte glanced at him, her expression unreadable. "The younger ones are scared. I'm trying to keep them calm, but it's hard when everything feels like it's falling apart." Nathaniel knelt to meet her gaze. "You're doing an incredible job," he said sincerely. "But you don't have to do it alone. We're a team now." Charlotte hesitated, then gave a small nod. "Can you help me with something?" Nathaniel asked, standing. "What?" "Let's make a game out of getting everyone settled," he suggested. "You can help me keep things organized. I'll follow your lead." Charlotte seemed taken aback, but eventually nodded again. "Okay." With Charlotte's help, Nathaniel organized the children into small groups, assigning simple tasks to distract them from the storm. The younger ones played a quiet version of hide-and-seek in the limited space, while the older kids worked together to hand out blankets and snacks. Nathaniel noticed how naturally Charlotte stepped into the role of leader. She gave clear instructions, reassured her sisters, and even coaxed a laugh out of Rose and Faith. "She's amazing," Mark said quietly, standing beside Nathaniel. "She is," Nathaniel agreed, pride swelling in his chest. As the storm began to subside in the early hours of the morning, exhaustion settled over the group. The children were finally asleep, huddled together on makeshift beds. Nathaniel found a quiet corner to sit, his back against the wall. Charlotte approached him, holding 2 cups of lukewarm tea. She handed him one without a word and sat down beside him. "Thanks," he said, taking a sip. Charlotte looked at him, her expression softer than he had ever seen it. "You didn't have to come," she said quietly. "I did," Nathaniel replied. "You're my family now, and family shows up, no matter what." Charlotte studied him for a moment, then nodded. "You really mean that, don't you?" "I do," he said firmly. For the first time, Charlotte smiled, truly smiled, and it felt like the walls she had built around herself were finally coming down. When the morning sun broke through the clouds, the foster home was a scene of relief and recovery. Neighbors arrived with supplies, offering their help without hesitation. Some of the very people who had once doubted Nathaniel's intentions now worked beside him, inspired by his dedication. Mrs. Jensen pulled Nathaniel aside, her expression warm. "What you did last night, it showed everyone who you really are. The girls see it too, especially Charlotte." Nathaniel nodded, exhaustion etched into his features, but a deep sense of fulfillment in his heart. As he prepared to leave, Charlotte walked him to the door. "Thank you," she said, her voice steady. "For what?" "For coming when we needed you," she said. Then, after a pause, she added, "And for staying." Nathaniel smiled. "I'm not going anywhere." Charlotte hesitated, then leaned in and hugged him briefly before stepping back. "See you soon, Dad." The word hit Nathaniel like a bolt of lightning, unexpected, powerful, and transformative. He blinked, his throat tight, but managed to say, "See you soon, Charlotte." As Nathaniel drove home, the fatigue of the night melted away, replaced by a profound sense of belonging. For the first time in years, he felt like he truly had a family, and he would do everything in his power to keep it. Nathaniel Blake stood in the front yard of Starlight Haven, now surrounded by the lively chatter of neighbors, volunteers, and the girls. The storm had passed days ago, but its aftermath had brought a renewed sense of unity. What once felt like a tenuous connection to the girls now felt solid, unshakable. Charlotte was beside him, organizing the other children for a group activity. She moved with quiet confidence, issuing instructions while keeping a watchful eye on her sisters. Every so often, she glanced at Nathaniel, her expression no longer skeptical, but warm with trust. "Mr. Blake," Mrs. Jensen called, waving him over. He excused himself and walked toward her. She was standing near the freshly delivered supplies that would help repair the damage caused by the flood. "You've made quite the impression," she said, her tone both teasing and genuine. Nathaniel smiled, glancing back at the girls. "I had good teachers." Mrs. Jensen chuckled. "Well, you'll be glad to know the community has taken notice. The skepticism about your motives has turned into admiration. I even heard someone call you a hero." Nathaniel shook his head, his expression thoughtful. "Ignoro. I'm just trying to be the kind of person they need me to be." Mrs. Jensen's gaze softened. "That's more than enough." The girls insisted that Nathaniel stay for dinner, and the evening turned into a celebration of resilience and family. They crowded around the dining table, laughing and sharing stories, the room filled with the warmth of companionship. As the meal wound down, Nathaniel tapped his glass gently to get their attention. "I want to say something," he began, his voice steady but full of emotion. "These past few months have been some of the most challenging of my life, but also the most rewarding. When I first brought you into my home, I didn't know what I was doing. And when I let you go, I made the biggest mistake of my life." He paused, glancing at each of the girls, their faces rapt with attention. "But you gave me a second chance," he continued. "You let me come back and try again, even when I didn't deserve it. You've taught me what it means to be part of a family, not because we're perfect, but because we show up for each other, no matter what." Charlotte, sitting closest to him, nodded slightly, her eyes shining with quiet emotion. "So, from now on," Nathaniel said, his voice firm, "I promise you'll never have to wonder if I'll be there. I'm here, and I'm staying." The room erupted in cheers and applause, with Rose throwing her arms around his neck and Faith clapping enthusiastically. Even Charlotte smiled, a rare but genuine expression that lit up her face. In the weeks that followed, the transformation in Nathaniel's life became undeniable. He officially adopted the girls, completing the process that had begun months ago. This time, the decision felt grounded not in impulse, but in a deep, unshakable bond. Nathaniel also became an active part of the community. The Girls' Flower Pot project had inspired neighbors to start a community garden, and Nathaniel often worked alongside them, planting seeds and pulling weeds. Charlotte continued to thrive in her role as a leader, but she also allowed herself to lean on Nathaniel more, sharing her thoughts and concerns with him in quiet moments. Emily, Grace, and Abigail flourished in their studies, while the younger girls delighted in the playful chaos of their new home. One sunny afternoon, the community hosted a picnic in the park to honor the foster home's recovery and the resilience of its children. Nathaniel and the girls arrived together, greeted warmly by neighbors and friends. As they sat on a blanket, enjoying sandwiches and lemonade, Charlotte leaned over to Nathaniel. "Do you still think you weren't good enough to be a dad?" she asked, her tone teasing but sincere. Nathaniel looked at her, his heart swelling with pride and gratitude. "Not anymore," he said. "But that's because I have the best family helping me figure it out." Charlotte smiled, a wide, unguarded grin that Nathaniel knew he would treasure forever. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Nathaniel watched the girls play in the park, their laughter ringing out like music. He leaned back on his elbows, soaking in the moment. For the first time in his life, He felt complete not because of his wealth or accomplishments, but because of the love and joy he had found in the family they had built together. "Dad!" Rose called, running toward him with hope in tow. "Come play tag with us." Nathaniel laughed and stood, brushing off his pants. "You're on." Years later, the 9 sisters were grown, each pursuing their dreams with the confidence and support they had gained from their unconventional family. Charlotte became a social worker, helping other children find stability and love. Emily excelled in engineering, while Grace pursued a career in environmental science. Abigail became an artist, Lily a teacher, and Rose a chef. Faith and Anna opened a daycare together, and Hope, the youngest, followed her passion for music. Nathaniel, now retired, often reflected on the journey that had brought them together. His once empty penthouse was now filled with photos, mementos, and the echoes of countless family dinners and celebrations. At a family reunion one summer evening, as his daughters gathered around him with their own families, Charlotte raised a glass. "To Dad," she said, her voice steady and full of affection. "Thank you for never giving up on us and for teaching us to never give up on ourselves." Nathaniel smiled, his heart full. "To family," he said, his voice breaking slightly. And as the laughter and chatter swirled around him, Nathaniel knew he had found the greatest success of all, a legacy of love, kindness, and hope. If you enjoyed this heartfelt story of resilience, redemption, and the power of family, don't forget to subscribe for more inspiring tales. Your support helps bring more stories like this to life. Thank you for reading, and see you in the next adventure.